The title of my presentation this evening is Globalisation, Can't Live With It, Can't Live Without It. And by that title, I was trying to capture the contrasting thoughts and emotions which the word globalisation brings to our minds. Globalisation is a term which in recent years has been so much discussed and debated that it has become very heavily loaded with different meanings which provoke different, very often emotional responses. Globalisation, in other words, means different things to different people. To some people, globalisation is a fundamentally economic process which acts as a benevolent motor for economic growth in the world and brings prosperity not only to the wealthy countries but also to the developing world as well. At the other end of the scale, critics of globalisation see it as a tool for strengthening the position of a global elite at the cost of the poor and the disadvantaged of the world. We should also remember, though, that for many people, globalisation is simply a rather frightening word, a word which is not really well understood. It's a word which sometimes creates a great deal of confusion, even though it is very widely used. It seems to me that sometimes when we talk about globalisation we mean everything and sometimes we mean nothing. And I'm reminded of a story in Britain that many years ago the great philosopher Bertrand Russell is said to have hailed a taxi in London. He flagged down the taxi, got in the back, and the taxi driver recognised him from a photograph newspaper. And the taxi driver told the story like this, excuse the slight London accent which comes on me at this stage. He said, do you know, he said, I had that Bertrand Russell in the back of my cab a few days ago, and I said to him, Mr. Russell, you're a great philosopher, so what's it all about then? And do you know, he couldn't tell me. And that is sometimes how I feel about globalisation. If you ask me what it is, I find it very difficult to define. And the debate would probably be a great deal clearer if there was a single definition, a commonly accepted definition of what globalisation actually meant. But I suspect that at this point to arrive at a common definition is almost impossible. In terms of definition, it seems to me that, as we might say, the toothpaste is already out of the tube. In other words, the debate about globalisation is already so broad and so varied that a consensus on a single meaning is probably not possible anymore. What we can say with some confidence is that when the word was first coined, arguably in 1983, I think, in an article by Theodore Levitt on the globalisation of financial markets, it was intended as a fundamentally economic term. But with the communications boom of the last 20 years, globalisation has come to be seen as a much wider issue, in which there is globalisation of cultural, social and political influences as well as economics. So globalisation has become a truly global term. But although I won't try to arrive at a definition of globalisation this evening, I would like to make one point about the meaning of globalisation which seems to me to be important and significant in defining the debate. And that is the distinction between globalisation as a phenomenon and globalisation as the consequence of a set of policies. I think this is important because the debate between supporters and critics of globalisation sometimes seems to me to mix different types and different qualities of argument. Critics of globalisation seem to argue that globalisation is damaging and that it should be stopped. In other words, critics appear to see globalisation as a consequence of a set of policy choices which can be changed by the decision of governments and other players in world affairs. On the other hand, supporters of globalisation argue that globalisation cannot be stopped, but needs to be managed. In other words, they see globalisation as a phenomenon which cannot be halted, but whose consequences can be shaped.